Hey everybody, today we are debating whether or not racism is a significant problem in the US, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for this epic debate. As today we are debating whether or not racism is a significant problem for the U.S. We have CJ Cox with us as well as Kirby. And want to let you know, folks, if it's your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button as we have many more debates to come in the future. So we are very excited. This is going to be an interesting one. Want to let you know today is a special day because 100% of the Super Chats today will be going to historically black colleges and university scholarships for black college students as we try to basically once a month make one stream a charity stream, and in this case kind of doing our part to try to contribute to greater equality in the US. And so with that, hopefully our lag is okay. I know the last stream we just tried to do, we had some lag, and so it's a tough one, folks. Sometimes it's just random, and sometimes it just kind of happens like this where right now we're going to hope it keeps going smoothly, as so far it looks like it's okay. And want to let you know, though, both of the guests I am linking in the description, so that way if you want to hear more, well, hey, conveniently you can hear more at those links where I've put down there for you. And very excited, this is going to be an interesting kind of go with the flow type of format, 10 minutes from each side, followed by about 55 minutes of open conversation, and then we're going to have 30 minutes of Q&A. By the way, thanks so much of you. So I just appreciate so much. I'm traveling right now, and so the place that I am, the internet was a little bit unstable, and so I totally appreciate you guys, all the positivity and love as you guys are still here with us. We really appreciate it, and we are ready to get this going. So without any further ado, we appreciate you guys both, Kirby and CJ Cox. Thanks so much, guys, for being here. It's just a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
We will kick it over to Kirby then for his opening statement. The floor is all yours.
Perfect. So, is racism a significant problem in the United States? Yes. So just to quickly lay out our definitions, racism would be defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that a racial group is either intrinsically superior or inferior to other racial groups. A form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions would be considered institutional racism, which is what I'm mostly going to be focusing my arguments around today. So I believe this to be the case because of a laundry list of data that I've come across. I'll open with these figures and go from there. So firstly, despite being 72% of the population, 55% of people killed in altercations with the police are white in the USA. Despite being 13% of the population, 32% of people killed in altercations with the police are black in the USA. So while most victims were armed, black victims were more likely to be unarmed at about 14.8% of that 32%. Than white victims. So that would be 9.4% out of that 55%. So when you do the math, when you crunch the numbers, that means that about 17% of white deaths from violent altercations with cops were unarmed, compared to 46% of unarmed black deaths. Now, it is true that black people do commit more crime than the average white person, but I believe this is best explained by being traced back to the issue of relative poverty, which for those who don't understand, it's basically income inequality. So you have absolute poverty and you have relative poverty, and those are sort of the two sort of like sub-branches of poverty. Relative poverty is the reliable metric that most economists rely on when they're trying to deduce levels of poverty within a given society. So relative poverty would be disproportionate amongst black people in the USA compared to the average white person, as the average black family has about 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family in the USA, with the estimated median wealth of black households being about $35,000 a year, while white households estimate their median wealth to be about $150,000 a year. And my source for that is the 2017 Survey of Consumer Finance from the Federal Reserve. Now, the reason why this is important is because the greater the relative poverty in a given society, the higher the crime from the group closer to the bottom of that distribution. A meta-analysis of 173 cross-cultural studies on the relationship between relative poverty and crime from 1980 to 2013 indicate that the greater the relative poverty, the higher the violent crime. As per data previously mentioned, this would contribute to those asymmetries in crime amongst Black Americans, and that'd be the 2016 JRF Poverty and Crime Review published by Leeds Beckett University. Now, additionally, Black people experience asymmetries and hiring discrimination on top of that. The National Bureau of Economic Research conducted a field experiment on labor market discrimination in 2003. This study took in a large sample size where they sent over 13,000 employment ads in the sales, administrative support, clerical, and customer service job categories, and they sent nearly 5,000 resumes to various employers. So for those watching, what that basically means is that you have 2 resumes, you send them both in, they're both identical to each other. So they have the same qualifications, skills, the same template, they have the same age, the same demographics, except the only difference is that they change the names. The names are different on the applications. So one application would have what you would colloquially consider a Black name, and one would have what you would colloquially consider a white name. So same application, except this one says like Denzel or Lamar or Darius or something like that. And then this application would say something like Bob or George or Adam, Matthew, whatever. So the results from this study showed significant discrimination against African American names. White names receive 50% more callbacks for interviews. Applicants living in better neighborhoods receive more callbacks, but interestingly, this effect does not differ by race. The amount of discrimination is uniform across occupations and industries. Federal contractors and employers as well, who list like equal opportunity employer in their ad, they discriminate just as much as other employers. So if you have like a workplace that they tout themselves as like, oh, we're an inclusive workplace. We care about diversity and equity and inclusivity, like all that sort of stuff, that it doesn't matter. If you have a company like that, they're going to discriminate just as much as any other company are. These results suggest that racial discrimination is still a very prominent feature in the labor market. It's one of the biggest studies on institutional racism in the United States with over 4,500 citations. It was published in 2003. It's called Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? A Field Experiment on Labor Market Discrimination from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now, in regards to Black fatherlessness, rather than it being solely an act of irresponsibility, what it often is disproportionate jail sentences and arrests. 42% of Black families experience fatherlessness, while 25% of white families do. So while the majority of Black fathers actually live with their children, there is still a clear disparity. This is based on factors previously mentioned and the fact that there's evidence that the criminal justice system itself does exhibit racial bias. So because of this, oftentimes fathers are absent for a far longer and harsher period of time amongst Black families than white families, which would stack onto unemployment opportunities as a consequence of the hiring discrimination I mentioned prior, making unemployment higher amongst the average Black person than white person, and therefore contributing to a situation where they are either personally unable to support their own child themselves due to unemployment, or they just straight up absent because of the jail sentence itself, far more so again than the average white person. So as someone who considers a lack of father figures in the Black community a huge problem in regards to a child and overall family's upbringing, as well as someone who's concerned about the single motherhood in the country, this is something I consider to be deeply immoral on part of the criminal justice system. They not only don't care about the hierarchy of the family, but they also don't care about Black people either. According to a study published in 2014 called Racial Disparity in Federal Criminal Sentences, Black men constitute 6% of the US adult population, but are approximately 35% of the prison population and are incarcerated at a rate 6 times higher than the average white man. Now, a research report from the United States Sentencing Commission indicated that Black people serve 19.1% longer sentences than white people from the years 2011 to 2016. And that's actually been pretty uniform throughout the decade. So from 2007 to 2011 as well, it was about 19.5%. And it's actually higher within this past decade in the 2010s than it was in the 2000s. It was about, it ranged from like being 11.2% to 5.5% halfway through the decade to 15.2%. So it's actually higher the more recent statistics show that it's higher compared to what it previously was last decade. And that's even when controlling for criminal history, whether someone pleaded guilty, age, education, and citizenship. All of those things were controlled for in the research report. So that was published in 2017. It's called Demographic Differences in Sentencing, published by the United States Sentencing Commission. So to conclude my opening statement, all of these multivariate factors, they do stack on top of each other. From history on, while there was and is a gradual decline in racism amongst individuals within their own, I guess, day-to-day interactions, people are, I guess, more individually, like racially tolerant. Racism is still a huge problem in the United States, as it particularly pertains to institutions, and I believe that that is very significant, a very significant disparity. So that would be the end of my opening statement. Thank you.
You got it. Thanks so much, Kirby. And with that, we will kick it over to CJ Cox. By the way, a couple of little quick details. So one is that, as we had mentioned, all the super chats will be going to Black college student scholarships. And if you want to see the donation receipt, I am totally open to sending it to anybody. You can email me at moderndaydebate@gmail.com. And we are, even if it's your first time here, you're like, James, like, can I see the receipt? Like, absolutely. Even if it's your first time here, I'm happy to send it to you, as we want that to be fully transparent. And then we always send the receipt to the speakers, our guests, after the show, just kind of for, you could say, accountability and record-keeping purposes. Also, once in a while we see, because we've had some admittedly controversial characters hop on the channel here and there, we will host some controversial topics. Once in a while, it's rare, but we do see a person pop up here and there in the live chat, and by that I mean different people. Oftentimes, you're easy to recognize the people who use hate speech. You got that Kermit the Frog profile picture, and you guys sometimes say those nasty things.
Oh,
we
no.
have one strict rule: we won't allow hate speech here. So that's one rule that we have. I'd say, if you are repetitively harassing somebody, we'll give you at least a warning and say, hey, can you take it easy on that person? We try to not harass people. But if it's hate speech, there's no warning. You'll just be banned. So with that, excited to have both of our guests here. We're going to kick it over to CJ Cox and hear from his perspective. CJ, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, and I do greatly appreciate that. So I do want to just make very clear here in my opening statement, I won't be responding to anything he said in his opening statement. I want to save that for the back and forth. And I'm just going to kind of lay forward my argument, and then we'll kind of, like I said, have that little back and forth there to address some of the particulars. So I want to put forward a couple of rules that I think need to be kind of understood in order for us to properly go about discussing the solutions and causes to problems such as disparities in the education system, in people's income, and so on and so forth. The first thing is that dealing with the effects of something do not equal currently going through said something. For example, if you got mauled by a bear and you lost your arm, well, now when it comes to, maybe opening the fridge and also carrying a soda at the same time, you're not really able to do that as well as somebody else 60 years down the line. And that is an effect of an effect that you're having, then you're dealing with because you were attacked by a bear and lost your arm in an attack 60 years ago, right? But you're not currently right now being attacked by a bear. That was 60 years ago. It was an event, it took place, and it's over now, right? I think the same thing can be said of the United States. There was certainly institutional racism in the past. I do not believe there is evidence of institutional racism in the present, and for quite some time. And I also think that the racism of the past was actually a lot more limited than people like to believe, though just as harsh as it is oftenly portrayed. And I'll get to that in a minute. The second rule that I think needs to be understood by everybody here is that a disparity does not necessarily equal racial intent, or any racism for that matter. For example, if I were to decide I wanted to take a Socratic, I don't know if that's the exact word you would use to describe it, but view on democracy, right? It's, in other words, you need to be educated in order to vote. It's not a right intrinsic to you, right? If I were to take that position, which was the position of Socrates, it is significantly more likely that if I got that passed, it would affect a higher proportion of Black and Hispanic people in the United States for obvious economic reasons. However, that wasn't the point of the argument. The point of the argument was saying that certain folk should be educated if they want to be voting, right? In other words, doesn't matter your race. It doesn't necessarily even matter your class. You just need to know what you're talking about, right? Now, obviously, you can debate whether or not that's a good strategy to give people as far as, voting rights and stuff like that. But the point is, it's not racially biased. There's no racial intent in the law. And I think we need to accept those two things as rules that are not only going to be helping us explain this situation, but situations that we would come up in, any sort of a conversation, philosophical, political, and so on. Dealing with the effects of something in the past does not mean you're currently going through that event right now. And number two, a disparity does not necessarily equal some sort of racial intent. In other words, correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, as is commonly said. Now, I want to go over some definitions. One of them, of course, was already read, but I want to go over it anyway because I have a different view of it. Racism, the definition according to the Oxford Dictionary, which is the first one that will show up if you look it up on Google. Prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. There is a little bullet point that comes after this that says the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race. So notice it is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism, right? Very direct and intentional things, and done for a very specific reason, namely the belief that one's own race is superior, or, by default, that another race is inferior. If you define things like systemic, systematic, and institutionalized, which seem to be used interchangeably by activists in regards to this issue, systemic could be used with this, could be described with the synonym system-wide, relating to a system, especially as opposed to a particular part. Systematic, done or acting to a fixed plan or system, otherwise known as methodical, and institutionalized, established in practice or custom, established as part of a official organization. So if we take those definitions to mean what they actually do mean, there's a few things. First off, in order for a law to be actually racist, in order for something to be racist, number one, it has to be deliberate. Okay? You're not unintentionally racist. You don't unintentionally find yourself superior to somebody else, right? To give a perfect example, if you kill an animal in a brutal fashion, like a dog, right? We have laws for that and you'll be punished, but not the same way you'll be punished if you do the same to a child, because we have ingrained in our society a belief that human beings are superior to animals, right? And that's not accidental. So you would be able to find that. It has to be deliberate if you're going to actually prove something is racist. Number two, it does have to specifically target a racial group, either by singling out that one group or by elevating one group ahead of all others, right? So in other words, if you have laws that specifically elevate the white man, those would be racist because they're deeming the rest inferior. If you have laws that specifically downgrade the black man, those would also be racist. But you have to prove that they're actually doing those things. And furthermore, they have to be doing those things because they believe that they are superior or inferior, because that's the definition of racism. Other forms of prejudice, for example, ethnocentrism, for example, cultural hatreds and things like that, whilst they are certainly not okay, they're not the same thing as racism. And I would not argue that we have serious problems with those anyways, but nonetheless, to kind of just basically prove the point, the Irish and the English hate each other, but they are both white-skinned, right? So clearly that is not a racist issue. It's a different issue. It's ethnocentrism, and it has its own conversation. So to kind of reiterate, it has to be deliberate. It has to be directed at a particular group, either by elevating one group ahead of all others or by specifically singling out that group to be attacked. And it has to be done specifically because one believes one's own race is superior, because that is just what the definition of racism is. If we want to say, well, there is a disparity in poverty or crime because of things that happened in the past, I may or may not be inclined to agree, but that is a different argument. It doesn't rely on people of my race or my nation necessarily having a massive problem with racism, right? It relies on completely different things. For example, a lot of white people in the South are poor. Is that because of racism, or is it because they got bombed to smithereens in the Civil War, right? It was a total war. The same thing happened to a lot of other countries in World War II and World War I, etc. Thus is the nature of war, right? There's other things that you can use to explain away these certain statistics and disparities that don't rely on racism. And when you actually look at these numbers side by side with each other, for example, it is true that 20% of Black Americans are considered to be under the poverty line compared to only 8% of white Americans. Major disparity in percentage, But you need to understand that's still 15.7 million white Americans comparatively to 8.9 million black Americans. Now, if I was a racist and I controlled the world, forget the percentages, because we're talking about individual human lives. Why would I allow twice as many white people as black people to be impoverished if I was caring about the individual white lives and their superiority? Why wouldn't I make it 50% poverty, 60% poverty, 80% poverty in regards to the black people? Of course, I don't do that. And by I mean the United States government, because there isn't a systematic attack against black people. Now, there's a lot of other things I could say, but they would reference, I think, a lot of the specific things that Mr. Kirby said. So I want to kind of save those for the back and forth. So I'll go ahead and end it there.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, CJ. And also, a couple of quick reminders. I don't know if I remember if I had mentioned at the very start. If you have a question, fire it into the old live chat. If you tag me with @ModernDayDebate in the live chat, that makes it easier for me to be sure I get every question in that Q&A list, and we'll try to read through as many as we can. Also, Super Chat's an option, of course. And then last, I want to mention, we are excited as this is a new way of saying thanks so much for those who are our patrons. Appreciate your support. And this is something that even if you sign up at the lowest, $2 a month, we are putting all of our debates. We just started doing this, and huge thanks to Oliver Catwell for the idea. We're putting all of our debates on MP3. So that way, if you're like, hey, I want to listen to it while I'm just commuting or something like that, I don't have YouTube Premium, this is a great opportunity where hopefully that's useful to you. And our Patreon link I am putting down in the description right now with our guest links. As I mentioned, you can hear plenty more where that came from these guys' opening statements in the description box where their links will be. Thanks so much, folks, and we'll kick it into the open conversation.
Sure. So, do you mind if I go first, Jay?
Go right ahead.
Sure. So, I jotted down some of your basic arguments. The first one that I jotted down was you said the effects of something. I do not mean that you're currently going through something, and then you used your being attacked by the bear analogy. You meant effects of something in the past, right? Do not currently mean that anything is going on today, correct?
Right. So in other words, there's definitely effects from things like slavery and Jim Crow and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean slavery and Jim Crow are currently going on.
Yeah, so I would agree that slavery and Jim Crow are not currently going on. However, redlining back in the Jim Crow days began with the National Housing Act of 1934, which implemented the decay of minor inner city neighborhoods caused by the withholding of mortgage capital and made it even more difficult for neighborhoods to attract and retain families able to purchase homes. The assumptions in redlining resulted in pretty much a large increase in residential racial segregation and urban decay in the United States. And because of this, Black people were only able to purchase the lowest quality homes up until 1968. That disparity still exists today, and it shows in the data. All of the income inequality generated from that. A lot of Black people are still living within these homes today. There are even people alive today within the Black community that lived through the Jim Crow era. I mean, I think that that's very, very relevant to what we're talking about today. There's a really great book. It's called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. Basically what it did was it amalgamated all of this empirical research, and it sort of tied in all of what happened during those 100 years and explained how, when you correlate all of these different factors to what happened back then, it actually does bears out in data that it is relevant to the income disparity today. I don't really think that can.
Fair, though, just to quickly point out, I would agree that in a lot of cases, there is certainly things to be said about what happened in the past, because that's just a simple matter of fact. And to give what I think is a very good example, Jewish people in Eastern Europe, right, are objectively horribly impoverished comparatively to other people because of oppression, both on the part of the Soviets and the Nazis, which of course happened multiple years ago, decades even. That's an example just as good as the one that we have here, and the Native Americans here are another good example. But that doesn't necessarily indicate, because the thing when we talk about institutional racism happening now, and this is why I bring up the bear attack, right? It's reductio ad absurdum, but it makes the point. That's not something we're currently dealing with. We're dealing with the effects of that. Certain deals are kind of cut and dry, and then the result is just going to happen, right? As an example, when you decided to nuke Japan, a completely different argument, of course, but when you decided to happen, the deal's signed, right? Those people are dead. They're never coming back. The area is radiated. You have to now deal with the effects of that. But that doesn't even mean, not only does it not mean we're actively bombing Japan with nukes or anything like that, we don't even have to be enemies. We're friends now. You know what I mean? And so you see there, the event itself can be separated from the effects of the event insofar as the intent of a certain party, such as the United States government, or in some cases, white people, because there are quite a bit, I'm sure you would agree, of black supremacists for sure, like Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, and things like that.
Yeah, black supremacists are definitely a thing, and I definitely don't agree with those people. I don't believe. I mean, they do.
Not to say that you did. I just didn't mean.
No, I know. I'm just emphasizing that we are both within agreement that that is not good. No form of like racial nationalism is good. That being said, though, when these effects have been around for 500 years. And then what's happening today, and I mean today, like a lot of the studies that I cited, for example, are reflections of today. For example, again, going back to the one on hiring discrimination, by name alone, like Black people get denied callbacks for jobs despite having the exact same qualifications and credentials, even when you control for things like class. The only really thing that seems to be defining it is the societal view of race, and especially if you look at again the data that I mentioned earlier from the United States Sentencing Commission. You know, there's all controls, like all that's isolated within that data is race when it comes to the disproportionate sentencing. So the fact that these institutions are still doing this today compared to like the past, obviously it's not as bad, but there's still a lot of issues with institutional discrimination. I think it's very, very possible to acknowledge that today and the past are not identical to one another, but there's definitely a relationship there. Again, the law that was passed under Jim Crow law that segregated the Black communities off into those disparaged areas, all of the employment data and all of the data that I mentioned earlier, like that still stacks on top of that today. So not only is that the past's long-term effects, but there's also institutions in place today that are sort of keeping them boxed in there. Do you know what I mean? Like that's kind of how I see it.
I certainly do understand the argument. I do want to say two things. The first thing, I just really quickly, is the reason why I think it's so important to separate past from now is because when you say things like institutional racism, what it ends up implying, whether that's what people intend or not, because unfortunately, and I do believe obviously that your intention does need to be taken into account, don't get me wrong, but unfortunately people kind of understand things the way that they're going to understand things regardless of what me and you were actually going to say, right? A lot of times what you end up having is people who, on both sides, by the way, this is not a black or white issue, take this to the far extreme and they become even more racially charged. We've seen over the last 10 years, I think, a huge deterioration in certain ways. Obviously, it's not 100% the case, but there is definitely a rise in white nationalism, and there is definitely a rise in Black nationalism as well. Those are happening at the moment, and I think that's a new phenomenon that could become institutionalized if we do not stop it. I want to be perfectly clear on that.
Yeah, especially in Europe and stuff. Like I think like Hungary recently like actually appointed like an actual like fascist dictator. Like and the fascist party in Sweden too has been like the polls in Sweden in like 2013 for the, I don't think it's a fascist party actually. I think it's just like a really, really far right. Like they want to end immigration. I mean, it is pretty serious, but that party, like they had like 3% of the national polls like 10 years ago, and then the last election they had in Sweden they had like 17%. So like yeah, we're definitely seeing that, and it's definitely a concern. That being said, though,
part of that is this systematic racism narrative, because let me just give you a perfect example with police brutality, right? Because we've mentioned police brutality and it's a huge topic right now, right? So first things first, we have issues of police brutality in every community. There is a police brutality problem in the United States. I have been personally discussing that since the inception of my new show. It's honestly the very first thing I ever talked about, actually, because it's a problem. It's a very big problem. Now, the community where I was actually most harassed, because I've lived in two. I've lived 19 by 370, you get your percent. That's 5.1%. You know what I mean?
No,
So
because
5.1% of black or of white Americans who are killed by police, right, are unarmed. But if you do the same thing, 9 divided by 235 last year, that comes out to 3.6%. So you actually have a greater number of unarmed white people who are killed percentage-wise than unarmed black people who are killed percentage-wise. And I think that's a problem with police brutality, just by the way. I don't think George Floyd or Danny Shaver need to be pinned up against each other, but both were equally horrid. And we have a disproportionate reaction to one because of the color of his skin, which I would argue is racist. I mean, Danny Shaver was begging and crying for his life, you know what I mean? And nobody said anything. Duncan Lemp was killed this year, right? And he was only, unfortunately, actually associated either with militia groups, which, you know, some of them are constitutional, some of them are racist, and unfortunately other racists, you know what I mean? That's the only people who even took up his cause, which is not okay, of course, but the man was killed by police unjustifiably this year, same as George Floyd, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so what I try to do is, oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So what I try to really like avoid these anecdotal experiences when I'm talking about like some kind of like greater empirical thing like institutional racism. The problem with doing the math like that though is you still have to control for populations. The population doesn't actually intertwine once you do the math. I don't really know how we're going to be able to continue this point if we can't really agree on that, because if you don't control for the amount of population, the raw data that you're looking at, regardless of what other math you want to spin in there, is useless. And that's pretty much like consensus amongst like data analysts and stuff like that. Like you can't look at data that way when you're trying to get a sense of what's going on with a whole population of people.
Well, hang on though, because why not? Because what we just did is we compared the actual percentage of white Americans who were killed while unarmed by police to the percentage of black Americans that are killed while. So in other words, you're taking into account the fact that both of them are going to have, you know, certain amounts of stops, and one of them has a higher, you know, there's 370 compared to 235, so on and so forth. You're taking into account those population differences when you do this math, right? That's why we're doing percentages and ratios in the first place, rather than just gross numbers, which is still, to be fair, in my favor because it's 19 comparatively to 9. And again, I think that indicates a police problem, but it's not a racially biased police problem, right?
Well, we just have like conflicting data. It's just that what I'm doing is I'm listening to what the experts derived from their data versus what someone did on a calculator. So what I do as a layman, because I'm not qualified, is I have to look at what the experts are saying. And the data shows that it's 17% of white deaths from violent altercations with cops were unarmed compared to 46% of black deaths. Though I think that like that data point, I mean, we can move on to something else just because I don't really think we're going to agree on this. I would much prefer going to a more like causal example, if you don't mind. So like, I would like to know what you think of the study that I talked about with regards to unemployment. So what did you think of what I talked about with the black names and white names on the job applications?
So I think that that's actually a kind of a multifaceted problem, which I would definitely agree is a problem. But I don't think it's quite as cut and dry as we might initially think. So as an example, and we can do whatever we want with this assumption, but I think we can agree that the assumption of your average American, or even probably your average Canadian, if you hear something like Anquan, right, is going to be that that person is probably from a poorer, more rundown kind of neighborhood and so on and so forth. Whereas somebody named Michael is probably not. That's usually, maybe not in Canada. That's certainly going to be the assumption we have here in the United States, right?
Yeah, but
now notice that particular study didn't actually say there was a racial disparity, but a disparity in the names alone. So I think that's one of those, because of course, plenty of black people are going to be named Michael or David or whatever, right? And like I said, I'm not necessarily, you know, justifying this by any stretch, but I'm saying what I think is being described there, or what is being shown there, is people looking at a name like a, you know, like an Anquan, like Anquan Bolden, right? Or, you know, one of my favorite YouTubers, his name is he goes by MK, but his name is Jamiroquai, right? I think they look at that and they think this person is probably from a more rundown and impoverished area, which I think is more a classist thing, because there is certainly a little bit of classism in the United States. I would agree with that. But that classism affects races equally, just not necessarily proportionally. You know what I mean? In other words, there's 15.7 million. Say again?
The study controlled for class. The applications were identical to one another.
Right, I know, and I understand that. But what I'm saying is that people have those inherent assumptions within them because of what I think are somewhat classist tendencies. Because for the average person, this is, again, an assumption I'm making. I do want to be fair. This is not something that I have backed up with data. But I think the average person, if you walk up to them and said, hey, this man's name is Jamiroquai, and told them nothing else, right, they would immediately have a picture in their head. And to be fair, maybe that's a little bit of a stereotypical picture. I'm not even going to deny that, right? That's
just a
problem.
So if somebody was named Jamiroquai, like if someone had a name that was more colloquially considered a black name, and then you said that name to somebody without looking at them, and then you just assumed, oh, well, they must be poor. They must be. Isn't that racist?
Not necessarily. It's more of a cultural thing, because what you're assuming specifically in the name there. And like I said, you can decide whether or not this is a good or bad thing. I'm just saying what I believe this is you're basically making an assumption about the culture that's going to be put forward by this person. Because if you told somebody, my name is Michael, and also included the detail that he was black, you wouldn't actually have you wouldn't have the same reaction, right? People would react to that person, even knowing his race, better than they would react to and actually, if I know the study that you're quoting, which to be fair, I don't have it with me right now, so maybe you can correct me on this, but I believe that same study did indicate that heavily ethnic sounding white names also did actually have the same problem. And you ended up actually saying yourself that there seems to be an issue like across the, I'm trying to remember exactly how you said it. I guess I can't really remember. So
I can clarify.
Correct me on this, but there was a disproportionate hiring amongst certain groups of people that didn't seem to actually matter as far as the race was concerned, but more was associated with how rundown the neighborhood was supposed to be. Right?
No. What I was saying is that if a neighborhood was a poor neighborhood, it didn't have an effect.
Right. And that is the crux of my argument when it comes to this, is I think people make classist assumptions in the United States, regardless of your race, based on certain things that may not even actually have anything to do with your class, such as the neighborhood you live in and the name that you have, right?
So in the study, do you think that when the employers were looking through all of these applications, they weren't reading the full applications? Because the applications they were identical to one another with the same qualifications, same educational standing. There's nothing about the applications themselves that would have indicated that somebody is from a poorer neighborhood. Literally, the only thing that was different was their names. So,
well, correct me if I'm wrong, but those are two different studies, right? The poorer neighborhood one is one study, and the name one is another, right?
No, they're the same study.
They're the same study. So then, what is the relation? Because you said that people who were assumed to come down from
maybe I'm misunderstanding what you meant by a poorer neighborhood study. Like you said that something about like something not differing by race, and I did use that like exact wording when I was talking about the employment discrimination study.
Right, because there's the study indicated, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? But the study indicated that if you came from a more rundown or believed to be poor community, regardless of your race, that people were at a discrimination against you as far as hiring was concerned. Is that correct?
The discrimination was still white names still received 50% more callbacks, regardless of what neighborhood they were from, whether it was a richer neighborhood, a poorer neighborhood, or whatever.
No, right, and I understand that. People's presupposition doesn't need to make any sense, because and oftentimes it doesn't, right? Yes. Stereotypes very often don't make any sense. But what I'm saying is that what is indicated by the fact that people were deciding, hey, I'm going to turn you away because there's a problem with the neighborhood you grew up in, is the same thing that I'm seeing in this other thing, which is, hey, I'm going to turn you away because of the name you have. And both of those things, what you have is an inherent cultural centric and classist assumption that they don't want. And I understand you're saying, well, these other people, they adjust for class and things like that. I'm not saying that what the person who's doing the hiring is going to say makes any sense as far as that's concerned. What I'm saying is that those certain presuppositions and biases against, for example, the neighborhood somebody grew up in, or against, for example, the name somebody might have, are things that are more related to their what they perceive to be really crime-ridden and lazy people, which, to be fair, like I said, that could be a problem. That could certainly be a problem. If you believe poor people inherently, or people from rundown neighborhoods inherently, or immigrants inherently are kind of, poor and run amok and committing crimes and things like that, that's a problem in and of itself. But it's not necessarily a racist problem. I could think the same thing about poor Italians or Polish immigrants. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's just that they did control for that. Like, it doesn't matter. What I was saying was that if you change the neighborhood around, I remember what I was saying now. What I was saying is that if you live in a nicer neighborhood compared to a poorer neighborhood, unilaterally, the white and the black people within that poorer neighborhood will still be called back less than the richer neighborhood in sheer numbers. However, statistically, regardless of which neighborhood that you are looking in, white people will still receive a 50%, they still receive 50% more callbacks for interviews. So the study did control for that. It doesn't matter what neighborhood.
Because it's not necessarily that you're a black person, but more that the name was Jamiroquai or something like that, right? That's what the study was saying. For example, Michael or a David would still get a callback even if they were black. Is that correct?
Well, they did it just by name. Yeah, by name alone is what they based that off of. And based on certain names, because there's names that society colloquially considers a black name, like Denzel, Darius, whatever, Lamar, these aren't names that white people typically have. And the sample size was quite huge. They sent 5,000 resumes to people, 13,000 different employment ads.
Right. And so what I'm saying is, so the fact that you have the disparity between the rich neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods is one thing, right? That, and not related to the names, right? That's one thing. That's one fact. And
no, the study is related to the names. 100% the names. Like there was nothing else.
What I'm saying is, you have the disparity between the neighborhoods, right? We were saying poor people and rich people have a disparity, right? And then you have separate over here another disparity, which is white names versus black names. What I am saying is what is clearly indicated in the first one is some sort of a classist assumption that basically labels poor people a certain way. And I think the same can be applied to being higher than Anthony. I'd be willing to bet that, actually. Antonio, though, could be a white Italian person, and Anthony could be a Mexican person, and it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? And I think what is kind of inherent in there is this sort of classist and also a little bit anti-immigrant, I'll be honest with you. But once again, there's plenty of white immigrants. That's not necessarily racist.
Well, not necessarily, I guess. But regardless, I don't really think that's relevant to this particular study because they weren't looking at people who would be white passing. I don't think that you would find someone who was white passing named like Shaniqua. I think that is very, very, very rare. And I think that the common assumption within society, because assumptions are often based off of generalizations, when you see a name like Lamar, it's very unlikely that a white person is going to have the name Lamar. Now, maybe that's possible, but I think that it's very, very obvious within the study that I don't know what other assumption would be. I don't know how you draw class with George versus Lamar without incorporating race into that. And the study accounted for class. Again, these employers,
like I said, that's why I would want to look at. That's why I would want to look at ethnic sounding white names, because while you may not find a Lamar who is a white person, at least typically, you'll certainly find a Giovanni. You can certainly find an Antonio. You can certainly find loads of Spanish names, right? The Spanish people are white skinned for the most part. French names, for example. And a lot of those areas do certainly have certain biases against them. I think one of the most famous in America is certainly Irish people, because there was a lot of bias against Irish people for numerous reasons, and that, of course, carried over from England, right? And so that's why what I'm saying is I would want to see that same study done, but instead of focusing specifically on the black names, start focusing specifically on some Hispanic-sounding names. Start focusing specifically on the ethnic-sounding white names and see if you get the same thing. And if you do, then I'm saying that would, which I would assume you would, that's the hypothesis that I would put forward, right?
Yeah.
I think that you end up finding the same general disparity. And the reason is, and I'm quoting now this other disparity that you had pointed out, right? I think there is classist assumptions against certain group of people. And we know that because this other thing is already something that's an established fact, right? If you are from a richer neighborhood, white, black doesn't matter. You're more likely to get a call back. If you're from a poorer neighborhood, white, black doesn't matter, right? So we know that part. What we don't know is necessarily is if Lamar is being discriminated against is strictly because Lamar sounds black or if Lamar sounds quote unquote ethnic to the average suburbanite American, the same way Giovanni might, or the same way something like Liu Kang or whatever, you know what I mean? I know Liu Kang's a character, but I don't really know very much Asian names, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but like,
but you know what I'm saying? Like,
is there data that exists on this though, with like that accounts for this stuff? Because if we don't have data on this at present, I mean, this just sounds like conjecture, right? Like,
well, I would put forward definitely that is simply a hypothesis that is based off of previously existing data that doesn't necessarily correlate to the name, right? In other words, I think if we did that study, excuse me?
Sorry, there's previously existing data on the other names?
No, what I'm saying is that there's previously existing data as far as the way people portray richer versus poorer people and the way people portray people from rich neighborhoods versus poor neighborhoods and so on and so forth, right? So that data exists. What we have here now is a question of why is it that these very African-American sounding names are discriminated against? And what I'm saying is if you did the same study, which does not exist to my knowledge for the record, but I believe if you did the same study on ethnic sounding white names, Hispanic names, Indian names, and etc. Although to be fair, there's kind of a reverse thing, I guess, with Indian and Asian names. They typically are overqualified in the minds of the suburbanite.
But the qualifications were the same when they did the study. Just to reemphasize that, the qualifications were identical.
No, and I understand that. What I meant by overqualified, maybe that's the wrong word, but what I meant is a lot of white people and really just American people in general. They kind of have this idea about Indian and Asian people that they're kind of smarter than everybody else, right? They have the reverse, I think. If you were to hear something like I don't know what a Chinese name is. I'm not very.
I think a lot of Asian people would consider that racist if they assume that they're like, oh, smart, like big brain in school because on the basis of their race or ethnicity or whatever. I mean, I think that would be. I think that there would be a lot. To be fair,
it might be, but that is probably the general assumption, though, is what I'm saying. Whether or not it's racist is irrelevant. I do think it's probably the general assumption, you know what I mean? Because that's definitely something that exists in America. I mean, they tell jokes about it all the time for, Family Guy and The Simpsons and stuff like that. So
those are jokes though, right? Like we're referring to like society in general and what they think, right? So,
well, and regardless, not the point, like I said, it may or may not be, racist, but the point was just that I think there's a different set of assumptions when it comes to certain races. But my point here in this regard.
Yeah, that would be racist.
Well, I mean, I don't know necessarily.
Assumptions given to certain races, because I'd say that would be racist.
Say again?
If there are different sets of assumptions given to certain races based on them being racist, I think that many of those races would consider that racist. I know that was a little tongue twister there, but.
Well, so I to be fair, I think everybody makes certain assumptions, and I don't think they're all necessarily racist because you have to. I mean, there are tons and tons in all the different races of assumptions people make, and some of them are true, some of them are not. And when I say true, I mean generally true, not true to a rule, right? But people just make assumptions. You make assumptions, not necessarily you, but you, the colloquial American and citizen, make assumptions about Catholic people, make assumptions about Mongolian people, make assumptions about the Irish versus the English, right? When you hear a group attached to something, you make certain assumptions about the group. I don't think that necessarily means that it's racist per se. I mean, it's not like you're hating somebody because you assume, like, for example, there's the common joke about black people eating watermelon, right? Okay, well, maybe you don't like watermelon and you're a black person, but that's not necessarily racist. So what? There's a cultural link with watermelon. I mean, there's a cultural link with unseasoned fried chicken with white people. That's not racist. It's just something that people assumed, right?
Do you think that if I'm making assumptions about somebody based off of the fact that they might be black, though, and those assumptions are sort of like prejudicial, like say, well, I think that if I hear the name Lamar, they might be of a poorer class. It's generally, I would say that it's generally presumed within society that if you are of a lower class, that's probably not ideal when compared to being a middle class or a higher class. So if I'm assuming that a black person is like poor or whatever, based off of just like a name alone that sounds black, I don't know how that isn't racist.
Well, and I would agree, I guess, that there's a certain level of racial bias to it, but I don't think that it's unique, I guess, is my point. So I guess, to be fair, I would have to rephrase what I've been saying. It's not necessarily that I don't think that that's racist. It's that I don't think it would be unique to Black people. And that's why I would want to see this study done about ethnic sounding white names and other kinds of names. Right.
Of course. I mean, various different groups. I mean, that's just a problem with tribalism, right? Like various different groups, of course, receive different like assumptions and presumptions about them based off of that given group that are not good. But just because those other assumptions exist doesn't mean that you can't, doesn't mean that if you apply those assumptions to someone based off of a given race, that it's not racist. I don't know how that logically follows.
Because it's not necessarily something that is done because you believe one racial group is superior to another. And that's so, for example, if you treat Lamar and Giovanni both, if you're a white person and you take a Giovanni who's a white person and a Lamar who's a white person and you treat them both the same, which is not very good because of an assumption that you believe that they're poor. Well, clearly that's racist because you went after the white person also. You know what I mean? On the flip side, if you have a Michael who's white and a David who's Black and you treat them both equally, the assumption is in the name, right? The assumption is in the name because people, and rightly or wrongly, I'm not defending it, people assume certain things about certain naming customs, where you're from, so on and so forth. Yes. I can agree that that is problematic, but it is not the United States government or white race as a whole or the police as a whole or any of the other institutions.
I never said that it's white people as a whole or that it's like
not the government. Not you, to be fair. Not you, but
okay.
There is quite a bit of talk in all different facets. I'm not pinning any one of these beliefs on you, but some people say it's police, some people say it's education.
So just to get this out of the way, like I'm not one of these like woke scold like SJW like activist types. I've literally just read data and I've just come to the conclusions based on what the data show. I don't go around saying that like white people are trash and cis people are trash and straight people are trash. I don't do anything like that. I'm literally just reading data and presenting data. That's all.
No, and fully granted, I'm not pinning any of these assumptions on you. I'm just simply saying, when it comes to things like, you know, when people say certain things like systematic racism and stuff like that, there's a various number of institutions, and sometimes not even just institutions, but, you know, political parties or ideologies or even races that they end up blaming for it. So I'm kind of saying generally when it comes to this, because I think for the most part, when you look at most disparities, they can be easily explained with things that relate to either past effects or cultural differences. I think in this particular example, that's not necessarily the case, which is why I'm kind of saying I would want to see the study on. We don't have that study at the moment, but I am supremely confident that if we did have a study on ethnic sounding white names, that it would probably end up yielding the same results. And if white people are discriminating against white people because they believe them to be poor, and discriminating against Black people because they believe them to be poor, then the common denominator is being poor, right?
I'm just surprised that this like wouldn't have shown up in the data at all. Also, when we're looking at like applications, I feel like the only way that you would be able to successfully debunk this study if you were somehow able to prove that like the employers that were sampled didn't actually look at the resumes and just like looked at the names and shucked it out. Like they looked at like employers look at resumes. They do look at them. If they pick one up to look at them, they don't look at the name and shuck it out. They look at all the credentials. They look at the ages. They look at the demographics. They look at all that stuff. It was literally controlled for in the study.
One sec. I hate to interrupt. I'll give you a chance to respond, CJ, but I just want to mention, probably in a few minutes, we'll go into Q&A. Wanted to let you know, folks, first, I am so thankful that you've stuck with us through all of these stream challenges. Sometimes I want to cry. No, I'm kidding. We're okay. No crying, I promise. But I really do appreciate all of you guys watching. And what we're going to do, just so you know, folks, is some of these stream pieces are like, they're in pieces, so I'm going to stitch together like the different pieces of the stream into a nice single video that I will both share with our speakers, who I have linked in the description, by the way, in case you want to hear more of these guys. And also we will re-upload it here at Modern Day Debate probably by tonight. So just want to let you know, we appreciate you guys being so supportive. it's if this is your first time here, we're not usually this bad. So, by we're I mean me and the internet. But these speakers, I have to say, this has been a really interesting conversation. So I've really enjoyed having you guys. And like I said, maybe just a couple more minutes, we'll go to Q&A if one of you is willing to, and it doesn't have to be immediately, but shortly, if one of you is willing to defer to the other and giving them the last word. And so thanks, guys, though. Back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can conclude real quick then, just because I don't really see. I think it was getting a little circular with the study, or it was at least going in that direction. So I'll just conclude by saying that, like, I think institutional racism is a big problem in the United States. I think I've presented an adequate amount of data indicating as such. I think that it's very, very easy for us to just sort of look at data and then say, well, it's possible that it could be this. I think that that's just the conjecture fallacy. It's very easy to say that. You can say that about any piece of information. It's sort of like a postmodern thing where it's like, well, we can break down what could possibly be ad infinitum. It's like, that's technically true. So I'm just not interested in doing that when trying to describe a phenomenon that exists today, because I'm a layman. We don't have PhDs. We don't have the funding to do these studies. I would like to see studies to that effect. You know, it would be cool to see how they account for like different, I guess, like Italian sounding names or all that stuff. I mean, that's definitely one of the better responses I have heard to that study. I have experienced a lot of less than adequate responses to when I've mentioned that study. That being said, though, it does control for class, absolutely. It controls for different neighborhoods. It controls for all of that stuff. It was purely and simply white sounding names versus black sounding names. So I would say that those arguments didn't necessarily rebuke that data, but I do appreciate the good faith attempt to sort of, I guess, see what other multivariates it might not have been accounted for, I guess.
And I guess the last thing I would say there is just to simply, I would want to point out that I think the primary discussions we ended up having today were, I guess, employment and police brutality. There was a little bit of talk, I guess, about income, but not necessarily so much. We didn't so much get into the income itself as much as just the employment factor. And, you know, I do definitely appreciate the conversation. I will say this much: if that study ends up happening and I'm wrong, I don't have another point I can see. So that would be something that I do want to just make pretty clear.
Awesome.
Yeah, this is a good conversation. I think we had good back and forth there.
Certainly.
Absolutely.
All right, James, I guess we're going to Q&A. Or...
You betcha. I want to say thanks so much, folks, for all of your questions. We're going to fire through these as fast as possible because we're a little over time. And with that, writer John Buck, thanks for your super chat, says, hey, Kirby, question for both of you. What policy proposals would you recommend for the problems raised here?
Well, I think that something that would be really good is, I think a UBI would be a good one. Like, if you make under a certain income bracket, I think giving a UBI to those under that income bracket for, I guess, like a certain amount of, I don't know how many years it would be. I mean, you'd have to do the math on that. Some economists would have to crunch some numbers, I guess. But I think like if you gave a UBI to, just gave maybe like a slightly greater amount to black neighborhoods as opposed to white neighborhoods who are living in impoverished conditions, just because there are disproportionately more black people within those conditions, you would definitely have to account for that. Certainly, though it probably could be the same amount. That would be one good way, just because I think that the most statistically significant thing that prevents events like the riots, for example, right now in the United States, those things happen for various sociocultural reasons. And I think when you leave relative poverty unaddressed for so long, like all the data shows that does tend towards violence, that would be a good start.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that would be one policy. I have many, of course, but
thank you. And then do you, for you as well, CJ?
Yeah, so I think that there is a lot of things I would want to address before policy, if I'm being honest with you. There are certain policies that could certainly be taken. I think for one, marijuana should be legalized. I don't understand why we have hundreds of thousands of people across the country arrested for pot crimes. That makes absolutely no sense. Certain fines, I think, inherently become fines against poor people. For example, car registration. If you want to register your car with the government, by all means do it. But I think the idea that you have to protect it from getting stolen from you is completely insane. And we all know, I think it's a money-making scheme in a lot of ways. I would also say, I would culturally call upon, and not just Black Americans, but any impoverished group. It's interesting, and don't get me wrong, I love Martin Luther King Jr. for a lot of the things he said. And I understand why people have the problems with Malcolm X that they do. But one thing where Malcolm X was infinitely better than Martin Luther King Jr. is the belief that people need to build up their own communities. People need to open businesses. They need to shop at those businesses. They need to stay in the home if they can, right? There needs to be cultural revolution. And by the way, lest anybody think that this is something that I pin strictly on Black people, there is a significant rise in most of the problems that we traditionally attribute with Black culture in white America. It's happening, and it's happening very quickly. So we may end up being equal before too long. But the point being, I think that would be the best thing. Open your own businesses, shop at those businesses, try to, make peace in gangs and things like that. That's something, of course, that a lot of people have had to deal with. It's very difficult, but that reduces the murder rate, right? Stay in homes. Don't be promiscuous all the time. That way that you have less amounts of people who are born out of wedlock, and so on and so forth, right? There is numerous problems, culturally speaking, with impoverished groups that I think
Jay.
should be addressed.
Sorry, Jay. That's okay.
So sorry to rush you. So sorry. But just to keep moving through as many questions as possible. Appreciate it. Thanks for your super chat. Writer John Buck, who says, opponent drops out, Kirby wins by default. That was definitely in the first stream. Thanks for your patience, as we've had many issues, most of which all are because of my connection. But second best, Bob, thanks for your super chat.
Sorry.
Being an
Sorry, I know. Sorry. That's okay. Go on. No, I was just going to say, when he dropped out earlier, a friend of mine who was watching messaged me saying that he got Ben Shapiro'd to death by data, and I just thought that was funny. Go on.
That's funny. Second best, Bob. Thanks for your super chat. Said, being in England and watching what's happening over there is kind of weird. Whatever. Black Lives Matter. Gotcha. Thanks for that. A poser of religion. Thanks for your super chat. Said, thanks for donating these super chats to a good cause. I love that you take action with the channel. Thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for giving your super chats and all of your other support. We appreciate it. And Oliver Catwell, thanks for your super chat. Says, education combats ignorance, intolerance, racism, and inequality. Thanks for donating these super chats to the cause and praying it helps us all become closer. Thanks for that, Oliver. Appreciate that. And Tioga, thanks for your super chat. She says, the white Sami, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Sami are being oppressed by white Norwegians. Is that not racist? They're both white skin color. I'm not sure who that's for.
I mean, if they're both white skin color, it wouldn't be a racial issue then. I guess it would be more so like an ethnicity thing. Because historically, there has been a lot of conflict between different like European nations and stuff. So
Gotcha.
Even though today we would consider them white or whatever.
You got it.
I basically parrot that exact response.
All right. And Raven Zero, thanks for your super chat, said, so what is stopping racists to be used a free out of jail card? Well, so what is stopping racists?
What is to stop racists from getting a free out of jail card?
Then they say, because anyone that said no to a black person is automatically a racist thing? What's the line?
Well, it's not that they automatically... Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just gonna say, I think this is a little bit of that sort of that Trumpism kind of coming through, if I'm being honest with you. I am a conservative, but I am not a big fan of the Trumpism. To be perfectly frank, whilst I certainly believe the media does have a certain view of race and that they definitely are disproportionate in the way they view certain things, I think the vast majority of people do not agree with that statement. So we're all fine. There is a significantly lower amount of racial hatred in this country than you think if you watch media, and that would be kind of my response to that.
And I would say that the data says that it doesn't say that like white people who get like if you there's nothing indicating that if simply turning down a black person at a job is racist within any of the data that I presented. I don't know where that's really coming from. All it says is that 50% more callbacks for interviews based on name alone with the assumption that they are white compared to black indicate that there is a large number of companies who do that. It's not saying that all institutions do that. It's just saying that there is a large amount of racism that exists within the labor market.
Gotcha. And thanks for your super chat from Matthew Steele, who's been on to debate before not too long ago. He says, CJ Cox, do you think that classism, obviously a massive problem in the U.S., which often manifests as racism, is a problem to be addressed separately from racism and other forms of bigotry?
I think it's entirely separate. I think it is entirely separate because it affects all races equally in the sense of gross number, right? Well, one thing that I think people often forget when they look at things like percentages is if I was a racist, I wouldn't care about percentages. There's 15.7 million individual white lives that are impoverished. That would be my problem if I actually individually care about white lives ahead of black lives. So sure, there's 20% of black people in poverty, comparatively to 8% of white people, but the gross number of white people is almost double. And if I was a racist, that would concern me, right? In other words, the class distinction and the race distinction is definitely different, even in the point of view of the racist, right? I think they're completely separate issues, and I think that they are mainly caused, if I'm being completely honest, by what I would consider to be a very cronyistic version of capitalism in our country. I think in the past, we had a very, very fantastic economy, quite frankly, when it was a little bit more laissez-faire, not 100% laissez-faire. That obviously caused problems, and that's a different issue. But I think that that's the main cause for a lot of the disparities that exist in classism in the United States. It's certainly a problem, but it's not a problem, I think, that has anything to do with racism.
Gotcha. Tiffany Bear, thanks for your super chat, said just sharing some love with the modern day debate community. Pass it on. The world needs more love and kindness. Well, thanks for that support, Tiffany. We are excited for today's charity stream. Cody Drummond, thanks for your super chat, says minorities have been fleeing their own country and leaving their own family members to live with whites, in parentheses, who are complete strangers, for over 100 years. Can we stop pretending that racism is a thing in America?
Just because immigration is good and that people want to come here and that we have good values doesn't mean that racism can't exist within that structure and run contrary to those values.
Gotcha. Thanks for your super chat. Whiz Bang says, what's both sides' definition of racism? Does wrong generalizations of any kind based on race fit into the definition? I think by generalizations, it means something like stereotypes.
Yeah, so I would say that it would depend on whether or not the person hears like a stereotype. So let's say a stereotype would be because crime is disproportionate among the black community, that you would assume that somebody, when you see a black person, that they were going to commit an act of violence onto you. I would say that that would be racist because you can reasonably induct that there is a belief there that on the basis of the skin color of that person, they are going to commit a violent act against you, with the skin color being the signifier in that case. So stereotypes, yeah, definitely, if I'm understanding the question correctly. And of course, they ask for a definition of racism. So as I said in my opening statement, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that a racial group is either intrinsically superior or inferior to other racial groups.
Gotcha.
I would kind of say that it depends. I think most stereotypes realistically are harmless and that people get offended over a lot of nothing. I think some certainly are very harmful. Absolutely. Everybody's very familiar with the Nazi propaganda and the anti-Semitic caricatures that existed there. And of course, we had numerous things here, not only in regards to Jews and Irish people, but obviously in regards to black people as well. And even, it's funny, I mentioned marijuana legalization. It's actually referred to as cannabis, right? Marijuana exists as a way to link it to Hispanic people to make them seem like they're lazy and take drugs. You know what I mean? So certainly that stuff exists and has existed. But I don't necessarily think that all of the time it is. Like I brought up the example of watermelon. That is completely harmless. It doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Move on. People think I eat unseasoned chicken. So what? Right? People think I can't dance. So what? You know, I mean, it really doesn't matter. It's a harmless stereotype. So it really depends on the stereotype itself, I think, is really what I'm saying.
Gotcha. And Tioga, thanks for your super chat, says they saw me. James, pronounce it right, in parentheses, are racially oppressed. Race and ethnicity go hand in hand.
Completely disagree. Complete ethnicity. In fact, ethnic hatred a lot of times isn't even actually ethnic hatred. It's as much as it is an incredibly complicated. And by the way, that does not justify ethnic hatred. I just want to point out. But for example, if you took a Israeli person and a Palestinian person who were very, righteously zealous on each side, they both have great points because this has been a bloody, constant conflict for 70 years, right? It doesn't matter that one might be racially Middle Eastern and the other might be racially white. Although to be fair, the majority of Jews in Israel are actually Mizrahi, which means Middle Eastern. As much as it is, there's an ethnic hate there. It's the same thing as gang violence. It's the same thing as football rivalries, really, right? There's a long-standing history that goes back, and it can be completely separated from race. And in a lot of cases, though it can never be justified, it can be understandable. And I think we do need to differentiate between justified and understandable, because understanding somebody who is still wrong, I think, does more to credit their humanity and help us actually solve the problem than just, well, they did an evil act and therefore it's evil. You know what I mean? They're evil and we move on. I don't think. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Next up, Cody Drummond, thanks for your super chat, said 99.99% of what these SJWs attribute to, quote, institutional racism, unquote, is just the way people dress, behave, and speak. It has literally nothing to do with skin color.
The data disagrees. Sorry, I don't care what SJWs say.
Gotcha. And Mystic Wolf, thanks for your super chat, says, hey James, love the channel. I would love to see a debate between conspiracy cats and Kent Hovind on creationism. Can we make it happen? We will certainly try. I was just talking to somebody about how we haven't, Kent doesn't always get back to my emails anymore. So we're like, figuring something out to get Kent Hovind back on the show, and we'd love to have conspiracy cats as well. So we'll definitely try our best. I want to say thanks everybody for hanging out with us. I have linked these guests in the description. So that way, if you're listening and you're like, I like that, I want more, you can hear more. That's why those links are in the description for you. And want to let you know, as a reminder, what we'll be doing is I will put all of these debates from today, the 3 or so videos of this debate, I will put them all on private shortly, and then stitch together all of the pieces of the debate into a single video that we will re-upload. And then hopefully you'll see it then if you want to see it in full, if you came late. It's always a fun time, folks, and we are very excited as tomorrow we are actually having a similar topic. It's not quite the same. It's actually going to be related. It's actually going to be, is systemic racism in particular real? And so that will be tomorrow at the same time, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are going to start it.
Wow.
That's going to be between Losar 1 and the provocateur, the controversial Jill, as he goes by, will be with us. And that last time he was on was with Vosh, so that should be a wild one if you guys remember that.
Oh, no.
So hopefully we'll see you for that one. And then I think Sunday we've got an evolution debate you see on the bottom right of your screen. And then we have a lot of other ones coming up, though. Right now it's an exciting time as we have a lot of debates with new people reaching out to us saying, hey, we'd love to come on. So thanks so much, folks. Very excited for it. And want to say one last thank you to our guests. We really appreciate both Kirby and CJ. Thank you guys very much for being with us today.
No problem, James. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you for having me, and thank you, Mr. Kirby, for having the conversation. It was good.
Thank you, Mr. Cox, for having the conversation. It was good.
Radical. And as mentioned, folks, all of the super chats that you have sent in today, all of it 100% will be going to the scholarships for students at historically black colleges and universities. And so feel free, for real, if it's your first time here, if you want to see that receipt, the donation receipt, to know that we're actually giving it to where we say we will. We want to be fully transparent, so we'll send it to anybody. And with that, Want to say have a great rest of your day. We'll hopefully see you tomorrow and keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable, folks. Take care.